No, I think it's awesome. I think it's so funny because she's like 22, 23 years old, and the whole world is watching her.
Yeah. There we have Ice, Sophie Cunningham, and Caitlin Clark that might be acting as assistant coaches tonight.
When Sophie Cunningham joined Caitlin Clark and the Indiana Fever, no one expected that a single handshake would spark one of the WNBA's most heartwarming friendships. This friendship will blow your mind. It all began on a winter day, January 31st, 2025, when the Indiana Fever announced that Sophie Cunningham was joining the team in a 4-team trade. The news stirred a mix of excitement and curiosity among fans. But for Caitlin Clark, the team's shining star, it was the beginning of a story no one could have predicted. When Sophie walked into the Fever's practice facility for the first time, carrying her gym bag and a slightly nervous smile, Caitlin stood waiting with the poise of someone both eager and uncertain. Their eyes met, and in that moment, a shy smile stretched across Caitlin's face, and it was answered by Sophie with a warm, easy grin. The handshake that followed was firm but tender, a kind of handshake that carries the promise of a newfound friendship. The bond was not sealed in that first handshake alone, it was also built in the corners of team life. In the locker room, they began sharing snacks, slipping granola bars across the bench, exchanging water bottles after practice, and telling stories of their college days. Caitlin's tales from Iowa were filled with grit and dominance, and they clashed playfully with Sophie's Missouri memories as they brimmed with passion and fire. Their laughter carried through the locker room, bouncing off the walls and drawing teammates into the warmth of their booming connection. Yet their conversations were not just about the past, they were also about the future. Sitting side by side on a bench after drills, sweat soaking into their practice gear, they spoke in small voices about hopes for the season. Caitlin admitted she wanted not only to win games, but also to feel like she had a partner in the grind. Sophie, ever honest, confessed she was determined to prove herself worthy in a new jersey, and together, they allowed themselves the pleasure of making the season unforgettable. So they began learning the quirks that defined each other. Caitlin discovered Sophie's habit of humming under her breath while stretching, and Sophie teased Caitlin about how she dribbled absent-mindedly even while talking. They began trading jokes, inside ones that grew funnier the more they repeated them, and with every chuckle, their bond grew deep. With time, practice no longer felt like a chore but a playground where their friendship grew roots. Laughter was the glue that held them, showing up in moments that seemed ordinary but meant everything. During water breaks, Sophie would mimic Caitlin's shooting form, exaggerating her release until Caitlin nearly doubled over with laughter. In turn, Caitlin imitated Sophie's fiery in-game celebrations, complete with stomps and fist pumps, and the entire team would burst into giggles. These small acts built trust, and trust in turn shaped chemistry, and that chemistry soon spilt onto the court in real, tangible ways. The two worked tirelessly on pick-and-roll reads, rehearsing until their moves felt like instinct rather than strategy. Caitlin learned that Sophie was to spot up at the left wing, while Sophie figured out exactly when Caitlin would drive and dish. But it was not until the preseason that their friendship was tested under the bright lights. The Fever's first exhibition game drew a modest crowd, but the energy in the arena buzzed with anticipation. Midway through the second quarter, Caitlin dribbled into the lane, defenders swarming, and in one swift motion, she kicked the ball out to Sophie at the arc. Without hesitation, Sophie launched the three, the ball slicing through the air before swishing clean through the net. Caitlin's arms shot up, Sophie's grin lit the court, and in that flash, the trust between them became even more undeniable. Yet the story did not end with basketball alone. Road trips became the next stage of their friendship, and the hotel rooms they shared stitched them even closer together. After long flights and draining practices, they ordered late-night pizza, the smell of melted cheese filling their room as they sprawled on twin beds, laughing about anything and everything. Sometimes they played card games, mock arguing over rules and celebrating wins with playful shoves. Other nights, they stayed up until dawn, talking about family, childhood dreams, and the pressures of carrying expectations bigger than themselves. So, beyond the hardwood and the headlines, they built a sanctuary in one another. Wins and losses came, as they always do in sports. But in their corner of the world, Caitlin and Sophie promised each other something greater. Sitting on a hotel balcony one night, they vowed to remain best friends regardless of outcomes. Whether the season ended in triumph or heartbreak, they agreed that the bond they had discovered was the true prize. And with that vow, a vow void of cameras and others in view, their story became more than a tale of teammates. It became the start of a lifelong bond. Every press conference, every headline, every away game seemed to orbit around Caitlin's stardom, and Sophie knew the kind of pressure that could crush even the most gifted athletes. So, one evening after practice, with the locker room quiet and nearly empty, Sophie leaned over and told Caitlin, "I see how much the world expects of you. I'll always lift you no matter what." It was a simple statement, but Caitlin never forgot the way Sophie's voice carried a conviction that felt more like a vow than casual reassurance. But loyalty is tested most when the heat of competition rises. In a mid-season game against a fierce rival, Caitlin found herself doubled on defense, bodies colliding in every direction. Suddenly, an opponent swiped too aggressively, poking Caitlin in the eye. She dropped the ball, staggering in pain. Before the referee's whistle even pierced the air, Sophie was there, hands pushing, body shielding, words flaring in Caitlin's defense. In the scuffle that followed, Sophie's protective nature overwhelmed her restraint, and the officials ejected her. The Fever fans booed the decision, but the image that lingered was Sophie's determination, how she stood unflinchingly for Caitlin. Later in the locker room, Caitlin's voice was soft but resolute as she whispered, "You didn't have to do that for me." Sophie just smiled and said, "Yes, I did." And when the tables turned, Caitlin showed she was equally unshakable. During another intense matchup, Sophie took a brutal hit on a fast break, her body slamming to the hardwood. The arena hushed, fear threading through the stands. Caitlin didn't hesitate. She rushed across the court, crouched beside Sophie, and refused to move until the trainers assured her teammate was okay. Even when play resumed, Caitlin's eyes flicked to Sophie on the bench, making sure she was all right. That devotion spoke louder than any stat line, and this wasn't just about points or assists, but about a friendship that was true even in the hardest moments. Yet basketball is a game of wins and losses, and it was in the losses that their bond deepened. On long bus rides back from road defeats, when silence usually weighed heavy, Sophie would lean back and mutter, "We'll figure it out. We're going to grow through this." Caitlin, still learning the pro league's rhythm, would often feel the sting of criticism sharper than the scoreboard. But Sophie's voice had a way of dulling the ache. In return, Caitlin would remind Sophie of her worth too, scribbling little notes on napkins after games. "We got this. Proud of you." Together they turned defeat into a mirror of resilience, each promising the other that growth was worth the grind. And then came the moment when Caitlin's body reminded her of its limits. A groin injury forced her to the sidelines, and suddenly the Fever's offensive rhythm felt unsteady. But where some saw weakness, Sophie saw an opportunity to lead. She stepped up, not just by hitting shots, but by being the voice Caitlin usually was on the court. She organized huddles, pulled rookies aside with encouragement, and carried the weight without ever letting Caitlin feel like a burden. So when Caitlin finally returned, she repaid Sophie with words that reached far beyond the court, and their partnership stretched past the hardwood. Off the court, the two were often inseparable. Teammates joked about their sister routine because they always seemed to appear together at charity events, team dinners, or simply slipping out for a meal at a small downtown restaurant. Whether it was laughing at inside jokes at a gala or sneaking away for sushi before practice, they carved out space for each other in a world that rarely allowed them privacy. Even in the simplest gestures, the support showed itself. During Caitlin's injury recovery, Sophie would carry her water bottle, toss her a towel, and cheer the loudest from the bench during rehab drills. And Caitlin, though sidelined, would grin at Sophie's antics, calling her the best hype woman in the W. It was never about grandeur, but about the little things that made the weight of expectation easier to bear. And when the spotlight turned to something bigger than themselves, they embraced it together. During a visit to a children's hospital, they both walked into the pediatric ward hand in hand, their smiles warming the sterile halls. Caitlin crouched to sign a jersey for a young fan, while Sophie knelt beside another, teaching her how to spin a basketball on her finger. In that moment, it wasn't about fever wins or personal stats. It was about the joy they shared with children who looked at them like superheroes. Leaving the hospital, Sophie whispered, "This is the best part of what we do." And Caitlin nodded with tears glinting in her eyes. Finally, the pinnacle of recognition arrived when Caitlin's record-breaking fan votes propelled her to the WNBA All-Star stage. And though the spotlight shone brightest on Caitlin, Sophie was right there, standing proudly at her side. As flashbulbs popped and reporters shouted questions, Sophie clapped the loudest, celebrating not just Caitlin's achievement but the bond they had nurtured. On that stage, it wasn't about one star outshining another. It was about two friends who had chosen to rise together. And as the cameras caught Sophie's arm around Caitlin's shoulders, the world saw what the Fever already knew. Mutual support wasn't their strategy. It was their story. And the first true glimpse of what they could become together came in the preseason opener. The Fever had been searching for rhythm that night, their offense stalling in fits and starts as the crowd waited for something, anything, to ignite. Then came the moment. Caitlin drove hard into the lane, defenders collapsing on her with arms flailing. But just as it seemed she had no escape, she flicked the ball across the court to Sophie waiting at the arc. Time seemed to slow as Sophie caught it, set her feet, and launched. The shot sailed clean through the net. A swish so sharp, the arena erupted before the ball even hit the floor. Caitlin's fist pumped, Sophie's grin spread wide, and the bench exploded. It wasn't just 3 points. It was a declaration that their connection was real, that their chemistry wasn't theory, but something alive. For fans, it felt like the beginning of a story that would only grow. And for Caitlin and Sophie, it was the first thread in a tapestry of shared triumphs. But the real fireworks came months later, in June, when they did something no Fever duo had ever done. On a warm evening in Indianapolis, with the crowd restless and the game swinging like a pendulum, Sophie and Caitlin found a rhythm that defied logic. One after another, the shots rained down. Caitlin pulled up from deep, her release so smooth it seemed rehearsed by destiny, and Sophie answered the next possession with one of her own from the corner. They fed each other, motioning, smiling, tossing the ball back and forth until the basket seemed wider than ever before. By the final buzzer, they had combined for 17 three-pointers, shattering a Fever record that had stood untouched for years. The scoreboard reflected the win, but the true story lived in the roar of the fans chanting their names, in the way Caitlin leapt into Sophie's arms after the last one fell, and in the knowing look they shared. This wasn't luck. This was trust, chemistry, and an unspoken promise that they could rewrite history together. And Sophie proved she wasn't just a shooter, but a complete force on the floor in Atlanta. When the Fever needed grit, Sophie delivered. Her jumper was steady, but it was her rebounding that stunned everyone. 10 boards in one game, each one snatched with hands that seemed hungrier than anyone else's. Midway through the third quarter, she muscled her way between two taller defenders, ripped the ball down, and immediately kicked it out to a sprinting teammate. Moments later, she drilled a three of her own, sealing her stat line as she marched towards 16 points and 10 rebounds. Caitlin watched from across the court, smiling like a proud sister, because this was the Sophie she knew, the fighter, the spark plug, the one who could carry the weight of any game. That night, the headlines spoke of her all-around brilliance. But for Caitlin, the bigger story was knowing she had a partner who could match her fire in every way. Yet what often stole the spotlight were not just the numbers, but the little flashes that revealed their bond. And nothing captured that more than their fast breaks. Again and again, Caitlin would secure the rebound, her eyes scanning like a hawk before firing a laser pass across half court. And there Sophie would be, racing ahead, hands ready, feet set, already knowing the ball was coming before anyone else did. One particular break became a highlight played on every sports show. Caitlin dribbling full speed, defenders closing, then at the last second, threading the ball through a defender's legs to Sophie, who caught it in stride and finished with a layup so smooth it looked choreographed. The crowd gasped, then roared, as the two slapped hands on their way back down the court. And in the laughter they shared jogging to the huddle, you could see it plainly. This was trust at its purest. chemistry that couldn't be faked. But greatness is also measured by what you do when the odds stack high. And Sophie's defining moment came when Caitlin couldn't play. Against Chicago, with Caitlin sidelined, the responsibility fell squarely on Sophie's shoulders. The game began with tension heavy in the air, fans murmuring anxiously about how the Fever would manage without their star rookie. Sophie answered by becoming the strength of the team. Every shot she took showed her grace for leadership, and yet she made it look effortless. She drained deep threes, pulled down rebounds in traffic, and barked instructions like a captain determined not to let her team falter. By the end, her line read 21 points and 9 reds, but the numbers hardly captured her presence. She led the Fever to victory with ferocity, and when the buzzer sounded, she pointed to Caitlin on the bench, mouthing, "That one's for you." Caitlin clapped so hard her hands stung, pride radiating from her as she hugged Sophie tighter than the box score could ever show. And Caitlin, for her part, proved time and again that she had ice in her veins. In the biggest games, when the crowd grew restless and the scoreboard leaned the wrong way, it was always Caitlin who rose to the moment. She would dribble high at the top of the key, the defender glued to her, and with a single crossover, she would create just enough space to rise and release. The arc of her shot seemed impossibly high, and time after time it swished through, as if drawn by magnetism. The crowd would erupt, teammates would jump, and momentum would tilt like a wave crashing in their favor. Sophie, always the first to rush to her, would slap her back and whisper, "That's you." And Caitlin would just grin, because she knew it wasn't just her moment, it was theirs, built on Sophie's faith as much as her own talent. So together, achievement after achievement stacked into something larger than themselves. It wasn't just Sophie's big threes, Caitlin's clutch shots, or the record-breaking nights that defined them, but the way each moment threaded into the next, binding them tight. Every assist, every rebound, every shared look across the court stitched their story deeper into the fabric of the Fever. And as the season marched forward, fans began to realize what Caitlin and Sophie already knew. This was no ordinary partnership. This was history being written in real time. A tale not of two stars fighting for light, but of two friends who chose to shine together. As the season ran through, their bond became impossible to ignore. Reporters asked about it in post-game interviews, curious if what fans were witnessing was as genuine as it looked. Caitlin would smirk and say, "She's my person out there," while Sophie would roll her eyes playfully and add, "She just can't get rid of me." Their humor only added to the allure, but underneath the laughter was an understanding that their friendship was both a refuge and a fuel. While the Fever's wins piled higher than anyone had predicted, the road was far from smooth. The spotlight on Caitlin only grew brighter, magnifying every turnover, every missed shot, every word she spoke on and off the court. At times, the weight seemed unbearable. Caitlin would be rest assured that Sophie knew how to soften it. One night, after a particularly harsh media cycle, Caitlin sat in the locker room, shoulders heavy, her phone buzzing endlessly. Without a word, Sophie plucked it from her hands, stuffed it into her bag, and said, "We're going for ice cream." Caitlin laughed weakly, but she followed, and by the time they sat on the hood of Sophie's car with cones melting in their hands, the noise of the outside world felt far away, and that became their pattern. For every headline and every storm, there was a counterbalance in their friendship. If Caitlin was buried under expectation, Sophie pulled her back to joy. If Sophie wavered under self-doubt, Caitlin reminded her of her worth. That constant exchange was what made them unbreakable, and what made the Fever's chemistry thrive. But nothing tested their resolve more than the stretch run into the playoffs. Every game mattered, and opponents sharpened their focus, determined to shut down the duo that had become the heartbeat of Indiana. Defenders swarmed Caitlin, bumping her off cuts, shadowing her every move. Sophie took her share of hard fouls, the kind meant to rattle her confidence. Yet instead of fracturing, they fused tighter. Caitlin would absorb the contact, then find Sophie with a pinpoint pass for a dagger three. Sophie would take a hit, then rise to her feet laughing, sprinting down court to chest bump Caitlin after a clutch play. Their determination to push through became a story in itself, proof that friendship could be a weapon as sharp as any jumper or rebound. And when the Fever clinched their spot in the postseason, It was the two of them who stood arm in arm at center court, soaking in the roar of Gainbridge Fieldhouse. Cameras flashed, fans chanted, confetti rained, and yet what mattered most was the quiet exchange between them. "We did this," Caitlin whispered. Sophie shook her head. "No," she said, smiling through the chaos. "We're just getting started." This was a bond that transcended wins and losses, a connection that lifted them both higher than they could have climbed alone. And as the Fever marched toward the unknown heights of the postseason, one thing was certain: wherever the journey led, Caitlin and Sophie would face it together, side by side, bound by friendship, fueled by trust, and carrying a story that had already become legend. What do you think about Caitlin and Sophie's friendship? Do you think their friendship is one to last? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. Also, click on the next video on your screen. You won't want to miss it.